Hello, everyone. Today we are going to focus on general exceptions. So we will have a look at certain circumstances where members are allowed to violate their non-discrimination obligations under GATT 1994. Now, these exceptions become very important because they allow members or World Trade Organization member states to balance their economic or trade rights or interests together with their societal interests. Many a times, countries need to protect their non-economic interests, and the protection of these interests might violate their commitments that they have undertaken, the obligations they have undertaken under multilateral as well as regional trade agreements. However, multilateral trade agreements as well as all regional trade agreements have the exception of general exceptions, which means that these exceptions or these provisions allow the members to go against their obligations as long as they have some really important interests to protect, really important interests at stake. So, for example, now we're all witnessing a huge pandemic where we can see the massive loss of human health, of human life, of shattering health systems in developing as well as developed countries. So, in the wake of COVID 19, we have also been looking at and hearing the news that countries are restricting or banning the export and import of goods and services. So, you might ask me, how does these restrictions, trade restrictions that countries are imposing during COVID-19 sit well with the non-discrimination principle? Because doesn't that violate most favored nation or national treatment obligations? Well, they may, but they're allowed to restrict trade or discriminate against like imported products for a temporary period of time under Article 20, because Article 20 allows WTO members to balance their trade interest with their non-trade, societal, non-economic interests that they have at stake. So this exception becomes very important, and we are going to study this for the next 2 hours. Right, so this is the plan for this class. We will first have a look at more generally what Article 20 is all about. We will then look at three sub-exceptions under Article 20. We will look at Article 20A, Article 20B, and Article 20G. They protect different kind of societal interests. And finally, we will look at the chapeau. Chapeau is the introductory paragraph that allows WTO members to apply their measures even though those measures are discriminatory. However, chapeau, as the introductory paragraph of Article 20, has its own essential elements that you have to satisfy. And then these elements are different from the elements or requirements of each of the sub provisions or sub exceptions that we are going to study today. For example, Article 20A has two elements that you have to satisfy. But after you have satisfied these two elements, you have only justified your measure or violation of Article 1 or Article 3 preliminarily, not finally. And then you have to go to chapeau and satisfy the two requirements of the chapeau. And once you have satisfied the requirements of the chapeau, only then you can justify your measure, even though that measure leads to violation of Article 3 or Article 1 of GATT 1994. Right, so let's have a look at what this article is all about. So as I said, Article 20 of GATT 94 is a general exception. Why do you think it's called a general exception? It's called general and not just exception because it has a general application. It can be applicable to all the obligations under the World Trade Organization laws and other free trade agreements, regional trade agreements, incorporate Article 20 by way of reference into their text. So I've gone through in the last 8 months, I've gone through a review of about 220 trade agreements, free trade agreements, which form part of regionalism. And I've seen that 99% of these agreements incorporate general exceptions, Article 20. So once you're able to understand what general exceptions are all about, you will pretty much understand the substance of exceptions in multilateral as well as bilateral or regional trading system. Now, here are the exceptions that basically reflect that sometimes trade liberalization is not as important as other interests that members have to protect. And I think this pandemic gives you the best possible example where members have to violate their trade obligations and trade commitments when they have more important interests to protect at hand. This exception is invoked by a respondent. So when a country files a case against a respondent, the country that files a case is the complainant, and the country that responds to the case is the respondent. So when a complaint is filed against the respondent, alleging that the respondent has violated most favored nation clause or national treatment or any other commitment under GATT 1994, then this exception will be invoked by the respondent saying that, okay, I may have violated the non-discrimination principles, but I'm allowed to do that under the exception of Article 20. Now, it is absolutely important for us to understand that Article 20 provides a closed list of legitimate policy objectives. So it only allows you to protect certain interests that have been listed in Article 20. You cannot go beyond those interests. And this exception is qualified and conditional. It is conditioned upon the invocation of this exception by a respondent, is conditioned upon satisfaction of certain qualifications. And often these qualifications do most of the work, right? Because there are so many qualifications and so many elements and so many requirements that you have to satisfy to be able to invoke one of the sub exceptions under Article 20, that these exceptions are very difficult to satisfy and invoke, right? So Article 20 reads as follows. It says, subject to the requirement that such measures are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustified discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or a disguised restriction on international trade, nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent the adoption or enforcement by any contracting party of measures. So that is the introductory paragraph. That is the chapeau, right? So the chapeau, as you can see, does not focus on the measure. It focuses on the application of the measure. So the chapeau ensures that a measure is not applied in a manner which is arbitrary or unjustified between countries where the same conditions prevail. So if you are applying a measure in arbitrary or unjustifiable manner between countries where same conditions do not prevail, between two different countries, developed and developing, for example, then this would not be applicable. But this prohibits you to apply the measure in an arbitrary or unjustifiable manner between the countries where the same conditions prevail. This is a chapeau. We will get to chapeau at the very end of this lecture, okay? But do not forget that Article 20 or invocation of Article 20 requires you to satisfy a two-tier test. And this two-tier test consists of, at the first tier, satisfying the requirement of the subparagraph you're invoking. Article 20A, B, C, D, G, F, right? And the second tier of this two-tier test of Article 20 constitutes satisfying the requirements of the chapeau. We will look at the requirements of the chapeau after we have seen the requirements of Article 20A, B, and G. Okay? Why are we only looking at Article 20, A, B, and G and not the other subclauses? Because they have not been relevant, they have not formed part of any WTO jurisprudence. These three subparagraphs have been most important and have formed part of some of the leading cases and WTO jurisprudence that you find today. And therefore, it is important to understand these three in specific. So once again, Article 20 is a two-tier test. At the first tier, you satisfy the requirements of one of the exceptions in para A to J, depending upon which paragraph or subparagraph you are invoking here. The elements required by subparagraphs A to J focus on the measure which is being challenged, right? And the requirements of these subparagraphs A to J are different. However, once you've satisfied that, you go on to satisfying the requirements of the chapeau, the introductory clause. And the chapeau focuses not on the measure, but on the application of the measure. And the requirement for the chapeau is the same for all the subparagraphs, because chapeau is an introductory paragraph, right? Okay, so let's get started with Article 20A. So Article 20A allows you to protect public morals. It allows you an exception to violate your WTO commitments, your obligations under the WTO law, as long as you can argue that you have to violate these commitments to protect your public morals. Now, it reads as follows. We've already had a look at it. So after the chapeau, it says necessary to protect public morals. And when we divide this little expression, we end up with two essential elements. One, it must be aimed at the protection of public morals. So the policy objective of the measure should be to protect public morals and nothing else. And second, it must be necessary. The measure you have invoked or the law which is violating the principles of non-discrimination, they must be necessary to achieve the objective of protection of public morals. So a two-tier test to satisfy Article 20A. It is as simple as that. The first element is that the policy objective of the measure at issue is to protect public morals. It must be aimed at the protection of public morals. And second, that the measure must be absolutely necessary to protect public morals, to protect this policy objective. And the second requirement uses a very strong word, and the word is necessary. So what is necessary? How do you define necessity? It has not been defined anywhere, like the like products case. So how do we go about it, right? Well, over the time, WTO jurisprudence, WTO court has defined necessity, and they have outlined 4 guiding factors to determine whether a measure is necessary to achieve its policy objective or not. However, we will not look at the element of necessity right now. So we will first look at Article 20A and only try and understand the first element of Article 20A, but we will look at the second element when we are doing Article 20B, because the second element of Article 20A and B are the same, the element of necessity. So they are the same, and therefore we will club them and we will do the second element of necessity when we are looking at Article 20B. Right, so let's look at the first element. The policy objective of the measure must be to protect public morals, right? So that brings me to my next question. What is public moral, or what are these morals all about? Well, once again, it's not defined anywhere in the WTO law. So when you look at the cases, different cases have defined public morals in different ways. There was a case that said that public morals denote standards of right and wrong conduct maintained by or on behalf of a community or a nation. And that's really subjective, isn't it? What is right for you may not be right for me. What is right for me may not be right for you. So public morality is a very subjective concept. There is a panel that defined public morality as a concept that can vary in time and space. depending upon a range of factors, including social, cultural, ethical, religious values. So, public morality can really be defined by where we come from, the region, the religious values, the cultural values, and so on and so forth, right? In addition, it can evolve with time. So, public morality is a concept that is not stagnant. I'm sure you would be able to connect here with me that what we probably thought was completely unacceptable or wrong, for example, 10 years ago or 15 years ago in our lives, is completely acceptable today. And there are many of such things, right? So our notions of right and wrong change with time. So, how do you give a definition to this concept of public morality? So there was a huge debate about it, and then the court said, okay, all the WTO members should be given some scope to define and apply for themselves the concept of public morality. Because what is acceptable for one may not be acceptable for the other country. So now countries are at the freedom of defining for them what amounts to public morality and what doesn't. And that really opens up floodgates to a lot of things that WTO members can argue would amount to protection of their public morals. For example, in this case, European Union unseals product. So here is a case where, and we've touched upon this in the last class, where European Union prohibited, they banned the marketing of sealed products in the European Union. Okay, and the ban was complete, but it only had two exceptions. So they said that we would allow the marketing and importation of seal-made products in two exceptional cases. One exception was the IC exception, the indigenous community exception, and the second was the marine resource management exception, the MRM exception. So in under the IC exception, they said that we will allow the marketing of seal products where the seal products result from hunts traditionally conducted by indigenous communities, and when they are conducting these hunts for their own subsistence, for their own livelihood, they are not doing it for a commercial purpose. If that happens and they have some remaining hunting products that they do not want to use for their subsistence, they can export those products to us, and we'll be happy to sell them to support the indigenous community. And the second exception was the marine resource management exception, where the seal products result from byproducts of hunting that is regulated by national law and conducted for the purpose of management of marine resources. However, you can only market these products which are an outcome of marine resource management project on a non-profit basis. So you cannot earn profit by selling these products. So these were the two exceptions. If you don't qualify for these two exceptions, you cannot market seal-made products in the EU. So um, note that EU seal regime operated literally into the EU market all or virtually all seal products coming from Greenland under the IC exception, because it was in Greenland that the indigenous community was hunting seals. So under the IC exception, Greenland could carry on exporting their seal products to EU, and the seal products coming in from certain other EU countries, for example, Sweden, would likely qualify under the MRM, the Marine Resource Management exception. However, as a result of this measure, as a result of this prohibition, all the exports or all the imports of seal products from Canada and Norway, which were major exporters of seal made products to the EU market, were virtually banned. They were all excluded because they did not qualify for IC or for MRM exception. So you see how this is a case of de facto discrimination and not de jure discrimination. So the real question for the court was this. The real question for the court in this case was, does the protection of seal, an animal, amounts to protection of public morality? So are seal welfare concerns public moral concerns? Why don't you Why don't they file their case under Article 20B? Because Article 20B is about protection of animal life and health. Why are they filing their case under Article 20A? 20A is about public morals. Does it amount to public morals? And the second big question was this. So the second big question was that, okay, even if we consider protection of seals as a public moral welfare concern, then can we justify how EU is allowing the sale and marketing of seal-made products that result from killing seals in Greenland, for example, in a less cruel manner? However, they do not allow the seal-made products coming in from seals that are killed in a more cruel manner in Canada, Norway, and other countries. So, does the amount of cruelty really matter? Does the amount of cruelty allows them to invoke the exception of Article 20A? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, a seal killed in less cruel or more cruel manner is a seal, is a dead seal, is a killed seal. So how do you justify this difference? How do you justify this differentiation between the two? Because you're ultimately killing a seal and making an overcoat or a jacket out of it, right? So the first question as to are seal welfare concerns, public moral concerns, to answer this question and to make sure that EU is genuinely concerned about seal welfare as their morality concerns, they looked at various things. They looked at the text of the law that prohibited the marketing of seal. And they also looked at the legislative history. They looked at the notes that were made during the parliamentary debate when they were debating about enforcement of a new law to prohibit the marketing of seal-made products. So they looked at this parliamentary debate history and they looked at the law and they found that yes, people in EU and the legislators in EU were genuinely concerned in seal welfare. And therefore, this seal welfare amounts to protection of their public moral interest. They were concerned about seal welfare because they were concerned about the incidence of inhuman killing. The killing was really gross and inhuman, and they did not want to abet the practice. They did not want to be a participant of this immoral practice. So they were allowed to file their case under Article 20A, and that's how they satisfied the exception of 20A. So, since then, it has really opened the floodgates for many countries to try and invoke Article 20A for everything and anything. There was a country that invoked Article 20A for banning the import of horror magazines for children, saying that it's immoral. There have been countries that have been allowed to ban the import of artificial hair, so hair wig, on the religious grounds. There have been countries that have been allowed to ban the import of certain meat products. And countries have also restricted the import of alcohol or certain kinds of alcohol based on the argument that importing or consumption of alcohol violates religious values, and they have been allowed to do so under Article 28. And also, countries have banned the import of gambling services. US gambling case is a leading case where US banned the import of gambling services, whereas they allowed the play of gambling when a domestic company was providing this service. So that became a huge case known as US gambling, and it was filed. The US justified its measure under Article 20A. So now the question is that public morality or Article 20A pretty much allows you to argue or invoke this exception for anything and everything, as long as you can justify that this amounts to your public morality concern, right? It's a very broad exception. So my question to you is, and I want you to pause here for a second and think about this. My question to you is, can a country invoke Article 20A to reduce gender inequality, especially during or post COVID 19? Because COVID 19 is a pandemic that is putting women to the forefront, at the front line of the struggle. Women are being harmed even more than men as consumers, as employees, as employers. And I am not saying that. The recent reports and studies by World Bank, ILO, UN, and major consulting research think tanks have shown in numbers that COVID is exposing, or it is increasing, the gender gap or gender inequality that was there before the pandemic. So my question to you is, now that the pandemic is really putting women to the forefront and victimizing or harming women as the employers, employees, and consumers, could we violate our commitments under WTO law and discriminate against imported products and protect one specific domestic industry or three specific domestic industries in our country if we feel that they're really important for women as employees and employers, even though it amounts to discrimination or violation of national treatment? Well, there is no special exception based on gender in WTO law or in trade agreements, free trade agreements so far. So, and there has so far been no case on gender equality where Article 20A was invoked. So no country, no WTO member so far has invoked Article 20A for fighting or justifying an action taken to protect or to reduce gender inequality in their country. But it is a question that is quite relevant today, especially during this pandemic, because yes, it is true, and yet it has been proved that women are facing a huge loss, but they would also form a huge part or a contributor to economic recovery post the pandemic, because you cannot exclude half of the mankind's workforce to achieve economic growth. If you include that half of the mankind's workforce to achieve economic growth, your growth will be faster and your growth will be inclusive and progressive in nature. And that's why, to achieve that inclusive and progressive growth post COVID 19, do you think countries should be allowed to invoke Article 20A to protect the economic interest or trade interest of their women business stakeholders, or their women employees or women consumers for certain industries? And do you think they should be allowed to violate their non-discrimination principles if they want to protect this interest and they want to reduce the gender gap? Well, that's a question. Now, how is the pandemic putting women to the forefront? Just to help you to think about uh, the question I have posed to you a bit more, for various reasons. Reason one, more than 60% of women work overall worldwide in services economy, and services economy is majorly hit by the pandemic, because services once lost, they are lost forever, unlike goods that can be stored and restocked and be made available for consumption in the future. Also, more than 80% of women in developing countries and emerging economies work in informal sector. This means that in working in informal sector means lack of job protection, so they might lose their job or livelihood any day. This also means that they are paid less, and this also means that they have no benefits, no employment benefits, no health insurance that they might need during the pandemic, and therefore that amounts to poor working conditions for women. And it also means that some women still have to put their lives at risk and leave their homes for the search of their everyday livelihood during the pandemic. And there are other reasons. For example, women entrepreneurs, women who are in business, who are running their own businesses, mostly run small companies, so SMEs, small and medium enterprises, And these small and medium enterprises do not have the capacity to bear the shocks of the economy, to bear the shocks of demand and supply that this pandemic is causing. As a result, most of the SMEs have to either close or scale down their operations. And women generally have less access to finance. There are many women, more women in the world than men, that do not have a simple access to bank account because they either need their husband's permission to open a bank account in certain countries. It still is a law, unfortunately, or they cannot open a bank account for mobility reasons or lack of financial independence or for any other reason or cultural barriers, right? So if they don't have a bank account, they cannot have a financial history. If they cannot have a financial history, they cannot apply for loan, they cannot apply for credit to revive their business post this pandemic. And it is also reducing, the pandemic is also reducing women's access to education because the education has gone online, the education has gone remote, and it is nothing but true that women, much less women in the world have access to technology and internet than men. So there is a huge digital divide between men and women in the world, and that is causing reduced access to education as well as to internet and technology for women. Plus, it is all being topped with reduced access to health because women in this pandemic cannot freely, or they might have fear of accessing hospitals or medical establishments, even during their maternity requirements. And there are many women throughout in different countries that are suffering unwanted pregnancy because they cannot access medical establishments for having an abortion, and that might put them a step further away from their professional development or economic empowerment. And increased household responsibilities on women, increased care responsibilities, increased child responsibilities on women is also driving them crazy because increased household responsibilities mean more time poverty for women, and that puts them a step further from accessing education, accessing professional responsibilities, accessing skill development, or accessing jobs or employment or business opportunities. And women are further being physically injured or psychologically scarred by the growing rate of domestic violence all over the world during this pandemic. So I leave you with this thought, not leave you as in the class, but it's time to move on to Article 20B. But let's leave Article 20A's discussion with this thought. Can or should the countries be allowed during this pandemic or right after this pandemic to invoke Article 20A to protect their women businesses, women employees, and women consumers who are being disproportionately harmed as compared to men during the pandemic, right? So there is an article that I've uploaded on this. I encourage you to go and read it. And that brings us to our next point. And the next point is Article 20B. Article 20B is an exception that allows countries to violate non-discrimination principles if they have to protect human life, animal life, plant life, or health. So it basically allows members to protect life or health of humans, animals, and plants. Right. So Article 20B, it's about, and it says that any measure is allowed as long as the measure is necessary. The word necessity comes back in. And remember, I told you that the word necessity or the element of necessity is a requirement, is a second element or a second requirement for Article 20A and B. And this is where we are going to learn, understand what this element of necessity is. So, necessity to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. So if you have life or health at stake, be it life of human, animal, or plant, then you could invoke this exception to violate your obligations under the WTO law. And it has a two-tier test. This is the two-tier test. The first tier, or the first requirement that you have to satisfy, is that the measure is designed to protect human, animal, or plant life or health. So the measure must be aimed at the protection of life or health. That must be the policy objective of the measure. And second, that the measure is necessary to fulfill the objective. The measure must be necessary to fulfill the objective of the measure, right? So let's have a look at the first element and then the second element. Right, so Thailand cigarettes is a case that we have seen briefly in the last class on non-discrimination. So here is a case where, if you remember, Thailand invoked a measure. It created a new law whereby they required dual licensing requirements and required their cigarette retailers to hold separate licenses if they wanted to sell domestic and imported cigarettes. And they also had a partial ban on the import of foreign cigarettes, right? And they were not, at the same time, they were not restricting sale or marketing of their own domestic cigarettes. So the panel ruled that this is a clear violation of Article 3.2 and 3.4. 3.2 because they were also imposing some taxes, some TV taxes to advertise imported beers, imported cigarettes, sorry. There's another case on imported beers, I'm confusing that. And Article 3.4, it was a violation of Article 3.4 because of the requirement of the license. So the question for the court was, is Thailand allowed to do that under the exception of Article 20b? So satisfying the first element of Article 20b was no problem, right? They could easily satisfy it. Thailand could easily argue that smoking constitutes a serious risk to human health, and the measure was therefore aimed at or designed to reduce consumption of cigarettes in Thailand. So the first element, that the measure should be aimed at the protection of the policy objective, was clearly satisfied. They had the problem in satisfying the second element, which was the element of necessity. And the term necessity is found in Article 20A as well as Article 20B. So whenever we are invoking either of these exceptions, we have to satisfy the first element and the second element, which is common between them, which is the element of necessity. And the element of necessity probably is the most difficult and the most controversial issue or subject that we have seen in WTO jurisprudence so far, because it has not been defined. It is not defined anywhere in the WTO law. And many countries have argued or tried to interpret the meaning of the word necessity in different ways. So over the time, panels and appellate body have clarified the meaning. In this specific case, they said that the import restrictions imposed by Thailand could be considered to be necessary in terms of Article 20b only if there was no alternative consistent with the WTO law or less inconsistent with it, which was reasonably available to Thailand and which would allow Thailand to achieve the same health policy objectives. So that's how they defined the concept of necessity. So looking at their arguments to satisfy the element of necessity, Thailand made two different arguments. The first argument Thailand made was about the quality of the cigarettes. So Thailand said that we want to ensure by this ban and this licensing requirement, we want to ensure that the quality of cigarettes to protect the people from harmful ingredients is ensured. We want to control the quality of cigarettes, and if we are importing cigarettes without any checks and balances, then we are not sure of what goes in the cigarette, and they might be using a harmful substance in the cigarette that could further damage the human health of our people. And the panel said, hold on, that doesn't make any sense. You have an alternative available that would allow you to achieve the same objective, and that alternative is to impose a non-discriminatory labeling. So impose a ingredient disclosure labeling requirement and require your domestic and imported cigarettes to display a label that mentions all the substance, all the contents that the cigarette contains. And you could also look at the disclosure as well as ban on unhealthy substances. So you impose the requirement of disclosing what is going in the cigarette, and you ban unhealthy substances you are scared of, you're afraid of, you don't want your people to consume. So it's as simple as that. Here's your alternative, which does not violate the WTO laws, and this measure that you are advocating violates WTO laws. And the second argument for Thailand was that, well, we also want to do it to reduce the quantitative consumption of cigarettes, to reduce the quantity of cigarettes consumed in Thailand. So we are banning the import. And the panel said, hey guys, it really doesn't make any sense, because if you want to reduce your consumption of cigarette, then you must ban the advertisement, and you must have difficult licensing requirements for the domestic cigarettes as well, because you cannot reduce the quantity of consumption of cigarettes by only banning the imported cigarettes and not doing anything about the domestic cigarettes. So the panel ruled that this ban or this licensing requirement is not necessary to achieve the policy objective. The policy objective, yes, it is to protect human health, but it's not necessary to achieve the policy objective because other alternatives are available. However, we will feel confident about the meaning of necessity and how we can justify the element of necessity by looking at this important case, which is Brazil retreated tires. So what happens in this case is, well, this case is mainly important because it has identified 4 guiding factors, not essential requirements, but guiding factors. Remember, we looked at 4 guiding factors to determine or assess likeness of products. Likewise, here Brazil retreated tires gives us 4 different guiding factors to assess the necessity of a measure, necessity to achieve the policy objective. Okay, so here is a case where Brazil imposed measures including bans. So Brazil banned the import of used tires in their country, saying that if they are importing these used tires in their country, it increases the number of used tires lying everywhere, and that gives rise to or a higher probability of contracting diseases, because used tires create perfect breeding conditions for mosquitoes, and therefore increases the probability of humans catching mosquito-borne diseases. So this measure adversely affected the export of used tires from the EU, because EU was a major exporter of used tires to Latin American markets. It still is, and EU had a huge problem with this ban. And in fact, there was no ban on the sale and use of used tires in the country. So they were not banning the sale of their own used tires, but they were only banning the import of used tires from abroad. And they said that they're doing this to protect their human health and life. Clearly, there is no doubt that this amounted to a violation of Article 3.4. Because it's a requirement, it provides less favorable treatment to the import, and the imports are like products. You use tires, imported or domestic, they are like products, right? So it was a clear violation of Article 3.4. But the real question was as to whether Brazil can invoke Article 20b. So the panel accepted the first argument. The panel accepted the arguments of Brazil regarding the first element of Article 20b. What is the first element of Article 20b? That the measure must be aimed at the protection of health or life. So Brazil argued that all the accumulation of waste tires creates a risk of mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue and yellow fever in their country, and that creates perfect breeding conditions for disease-carrying mosquitoes, and the diseases usually spread when these tires are transported from one state to the other, because we don't have disposal units of used tires in every state. We have very few disposal units to dispose of the used tires, and therefore used tires need to travel from one state to the other for being disposed, and that increases the chances of the disease spreading out between the states. And the panel accepted that argument. The panel said, yes, we agree with you. The first element is satisfied. But let's look at the second element. And that's when panel did a beautiful job of giving us four very, very helpful guiding factors to assess the element of necessity, the second element. And the panel rejected Brazil's arguments regarding the element of necessity. So they said, okay, the first element is satisfied, but the second element is not satisfied. Because here the question was whether there are any alternative measures that are reasonably available to Brazil and that would allow Brazil to achieve this policy objective. And panel decided that yes, Brazil has alternative measures that it could employ, and these measures could allow Brazil to protect these human health interests without violating the principles of WTO law. So why do you want to violate the principles of WTO law to protect human health? Then you can do it without violating these principles. And they told Brazil that, guys, you have the capacity and the experience to implement other remedial measures. And you have the capacity to dispose of tires. You have the capacity of opening up more disposal facilities and more disposal factories, units in your country. So why don't you create a disposal unit in every state? That way you don't have to transport the tires from one country to the other, from one state to the other. And that would reduce the risk of disease or the spreading of disease from one state to the other. So what the panel did here was the panel looked at various factors and they weighed and balanced these factors and came to a finding that the measure that Brazil has taken is not necessary to achieve the policy objective. And in doing so, it really, really made the life of us trade lawyers simpler because it created the four guiding factors. So it underlined the four guiding factors in a very beautiful, clear manner that would allow us to determine whether a measure is necessary or not. And these are the four guiding factors that you have to use to argue necessity to satisfy the second element of Article 20B as well as Article 20A. Okay, so the first element is the importance of the social value being pursued by the measure. So how important is the measure? If the measure is very important, for example, protection of human life or human health during the pandemic is the most important social interest. So if the interest is very important, it is highly likely that the panel will decide that the measure is necessary. The second guiding factor is the extent to which the measure is contributing to the realization of the pursued objective. So how much is the measure contributing to the realization of the objective? If it has a small contribution, then well, maybe the measure is not that necessary. If it is contributing quite a lot, then it is probable that the panel could find the measure to be necessary. The third guiding element is the extent to which the compliance measure produces restrictive effects on international commerce. So if a measure with a very slight impact, restrictive impact on imported products is challenged in a case, then the court is more likely to find that measure as necessary. But if a measure is having a huge impact, if it is banning all the imports altogether, then most likely the court will look for alternatives and they would say that the measure is not necessary. And the final and the fourth guiding factor is where the courts would look at whether there is an alternative, a reasonable alternative available that would achieve the same purpose. And this alternative, very important, that this alternative must be reasonably available to the country that the court is ordering to employ this alternative to. So for example, in this case, the court said, hey guys, if you look at these four guiding factors, we think that the measure that you have taken is not necessary because first, you look at the first guiding factor. The importance of social value is quite high. They are trying to protect human health and human life. Second, the extent to which the measure contributes to the realization of the pursued aim, well, yes, it's quite high as well, because it's true that used tires could give rise to mosquito-borne diseases, and Latin America, Brazil is already suffering from the problems of dengue and yellow fever. Third, the trade restrictive impact of the measure, it is quite high. They banned the import of used tires from all countries. And fourth, are there any alternatives? Yes, they can create disposal units in each state and hence avoid the spread of or dissemination of virus by employing this alternative. And they also looked at whether this alternative is reasonably available to Brazil. And they said yes, Brazil is an emerging economy. It is not a low income developing economy. It has the capacity to do it. So if, for example, at the other end of the table in this case, if we would have had a developing economy, a small developing economy, or a small landlocked island, then maybe the outcome would have been different. Maybe the panel would have said that, okay, there are alternatives, but these alternatives are not reasonably available to to the respondent, to the countries, and therefore the measure is necessary. So you don't have to satisfy each and every factor because it's not a requirement, it's not an element, but these are merely guiding factors. So you look at you analyze each of these guiding factors in light of the facts of the case and try and balance them, weigh them, and see which side is heavier than the other. So the decision you take as a court is systemic in nature. You balance and weigh these guiding factors and see which side is heavier and decide whether, in accordance with this analysis, if it's a necessary measure or if it's not a necessary measure. So it's a call, it's a systemic call they take, right? And before we move on to Article 20B, 20G, this is another question that I want to leave you with. So we looked at the EU seals case a while ago when we were looking at Article 20A, and I have been trying to think and question as to why did they file the EU seals case under Article 20A? Why did they not file this case against European Union under Article 20B? Because Article 20B seems to be the right article because it is focused on the protection of life and health of animals. So this probably would have been a better article to file this case. So I would ask you to really think about it. Try and think about the reasons. Why could this happen? Could this happen because European Union could not have argued that they were trying to protect seals' lives in other countries because you can only invoke exceptions to protect your social values, but those social values must have some kind of connection with your jurisdictional nexus, so with your territory, with your country, or you're allowed to say that I'm invoking a measure to protect pigeons in India or pigeons in Pakistan or Bangladesh, and you're sitting here at the other end of the globe in Mexico and you're banning the import of certain goods because you want to protect the lives of pigeons in India. Could you do that? Or the exceptions can only be invoked when you have some kind of jurisdictional nexus or territorial nexus with the objective you're trying to protect or save. That is a gray area. It is not defined and it has not been clarified yet by the case laws so far. So maybe that was one of the reasons, right? Perhaps because the complainants in this case probably thought that arguing a case under Article 20B might be difficult because we don't have any jurisdictional nexus between our territory and the seals or the place of the seals that we are trying to target or focus at, right? In this measure, or there could be other reasons. Think about them. Right, so the last and the final exception we will look at in this class is Article 20G. Article 20G reads as follows: relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, if such measures are made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production or consumption. So if these elements are satisfied, then you're allowed to pursue a measure even if it violates your WTO obligations. Right, so here is a measure, here is another exception, Article 20G, that basically focuses on protecting or conserving exhaustible natural resources, right? And you might see a clear overlap in these three exceptions. Public models have a clear overlap with Article 20B that you have seen in the EU seals case. And even Article 20G has an overlap with 20B and 20A, don't you think? Because conservation of exhaustible natural resources could amount to public morals concern, or it could also amount to protection of life or health of animals or plants. Plants are exhaustible natural resources. So let's try and break down Article 20G as we have done in the previous cases in three elements, into its three most important requirements. So to invoke Article 20G successfully, you have to satisfy a three-tier test. Tier 1, that the measure that is being challenged should relate to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, right? And the second element is, or the second requirement is relating to requirement. Now, this is important here. Unlike Article 20B and 20A, where the second requirement was that the measure must be necessary to achieve the policy objective, here you don't have a necessity requirement. You have a relating to requirement. All it says is that the measure must relate to the conservation of. It should not be, it may not be necessary for the conservation of. And third requirement is that such measures must be made effective in conjunction with the restrictions on domestic production or consumption. So if you want to save the air or climate in your country, you cannot just ban the driving of used imported cars. You have to also restrict somehow the use of used or old domestic cars in your country if you want to conserve exhaustible natural resource of climate, of air, right? So this is what the third requirement is, the requirement of even-handedness. Now let's look at each and every requirement one by one. Requirement number 1, conservation of exhaustible natural resources. So what is conservation? It is the preservation, okay? It is preservation or protection of environment or any other kind of natural resource. And then what is an exhaustible natural resource? Well, there has been a huge debate about this because there have been several cases where parties have argued that because the word is exhaustible natural resource, this resource must be non-living because living resources are capable of reproduction and therefore they are not exhaustible. They can never be exhausted. They can reproduce and regrow and come back to life. However, that is no longer the case. We are now living in a world where we have seen and witnessed various species of animals, plants, and so on and so forth being extinct, right? So, or being depleted completely as a result of human activities. So, now the consensus is that the expression exhaustible natural resources includes living natural resources as well, because even the living resources or natural living resources can be depleted or can be extinguished due to various human activities. And therefore, this would include living as well as non-living resources. Now, second requirement, the relating to requirement. Here, the requirement is not that of the necessity. You don't need the measure to be necessary to achieve the policy objective. You need the measure to be related to the policy objective. What does that mean? Well, the courts have defined relating to as something where you have a close and genuine relationship between the end and the means. The means is the measure and the end is the objective. So there must be some kind of close relationship between the two. And the end result may not be one of the results that the measure or the means is seeking to achieve, but the means must be primarily aimed at the protection of or conservation of exhaustible natural resources, right? So it must be aimed at the conservation of. It may not be necessary. So the test is broad, right? It is easier to satisfy the relating to requirement. than the necessity requirement, isn't it? Because in the relating to requirement, the court would not question you if there were any alternatives available to you. As long as you can prove some kind of close nexus between the means and the ends, you can satisfy the relating to requirement. And it has not been a problem in most of the cases so far. And the third requirement is that the measure is made effective in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production. So this is a requirement of even-handedness in the imposition of restrictions on like imported and like domestic products. So if you have not imposed any restriction, for example, on a product or a like product that is produced domestically, and you've imposed all the restrictions on the imported goods, then that amounts to an uneven discrimination between imported and like domestic products, and that probably would tell the court that, hey, you have something else here. Your intention is evil. Your intention is not really to protect your exhaustible natural resource, because if that is your intention, then you would also impose some kind of restriction or impositions or requirements on domestic goods, like domestic goods, right? So we will look at the exception of Article 20G in light of a very interesting case. A very interesting case that has, and that was the first case which clarified Article 20G, the meaning of Article 20G. So it is a very important one. The case is the US shrimp case. Let me give you a bit of the background before we get into the case facts. So it is a case that was filed against US by certain countries in Southeast Asia. And it was a time when US was trying to protect certain sea mammal and sea animal species in their waters, and they started efforts to protect sea turtles in particular, back in 1973. So they came up with an act, an Endangered Species Act, and then in 1987 they issued voluntary guidelines to their own fishing industry, their domestic fishing industry, to protect sea turtles, basically saying that you must be careful when you're fishing in the sea waters, because sometimes when you're fishing or harvesting fish in sea waters, you can accidentally kill bigger species like sea turtles that you're not intending to kill. And because of these accidental killings, the pollution or the population of sea turtles was reducing noticeably in the American waters. So in 1989, 1991, they reached out to certain countries in the Americas. So they reached out to countries in Central America and the Caribbean, because they believed that they had some kind of jurisdictional nexus with the turtles in their waters. And they reached out to them and they tried to negotiate with them that these Central American Caribbean countries should buy special kind of nets called TED, turtle excluder devices, from the US, because these nets would allow them to harvest fish from the sea waters without killing sea turtles accidentally. So US offered various negotiations, various concessions, and various training programs to these countries, and these countries had 5 to 6 years to adapt to this new regulation that the US was coming up with. And then what happens? In 1996, US imposes a full ban on the import of shrimp from any country that was not taking appropriate measures to protect sea turtles while harvesting fish or harvesting prawns in the seawater. Right. So what was the problem here? The problem, as I said, was that US was concerned about the way the harvesting of shrimp happens in countries, because the commercial harvesting of shrimp with traditional nets accidentally cause many sea turtles, especially the bigger versions of sea turtles, the bigger species of sea turtles, to get trapped in the nets, and eventually by the time the boat gets to its destination, these turtles get accidentally killed, not intentionally, and they were not the targets, but they do get trapped in these huge nets while while harvesting shrimps in the seawater. So US was concerned about the declining population of sea turtles in the waters. So US decided to come up with a new law. And it said that, okay, we have come up with a new technology, we have come up with a new kind of net that you must use in shrimping, in harvesting shrimp. If you don't use this net, then we will not give you the certification or the license to export shrimp to our market. You can only export shrimp to our market if you have this certification from the authority. And the authority would not give any certification if the country is not using TEDs, turtle exclusion devices designed in the US um, to shrimp. Basically, what are TEDs? So the uppermost diagram here is a normal traditional net that traditional countries or traditional fishing methods use for shrimping. So this basically, what happens is, the problem here is that the sea turtles, also because the net is quite wide, so when it is tied behind the boat, the fishing vessel, it causes accidentally many sea turtles or bigger species of fish to enter the net, and they get caught, they get trapped at the end of this fishing net at the cord end, and they eventually get killed by the time the fishing vessel arrives at its destination. So US came up with TEDs, right? Turtle excluder devices, where what they did was, it was quite clever, right? They inserted a grid of bar in the center of the net. So as you can see at the bottom picture, you can see that they have inserted a grid, right? It's a metal grid at the center of this net with some bars, with some metal bars. And they have opened fish eye at the top and a fish eye at the bottom. So what happens is, when you're shrimping using this net, the smaller species of fish and um, the word camaron keeps on coming in my mind because it's Spanish for prawns. So there's all kinds of species of prawns, shrimp can easily cross the grid of bars. But if a sea turtle accidentally enters the net, then this grid of bars would stop the sea turtle from going to the end of the net and getting killed, basically. So when the sea turtle gets stopped or impeded by this grid of bars, the sea turtle has a fish eye, has a hole at the bottom or at the top of the net, so they hit the grid and they can escape at the bottom or by the top of, through the fish eye. So this net allowed saving the lives of sea turtles to fishermen. Now, this came as a huge setback for developing countries. It came as a huge setback for developing countries for various reasons, right? Because one, it was not a cheap way of fishing. This was a net designed in the US, and it was very expensive to buy for many developing and least developed countries that were based on fisheries. So their economy was based on fisheries industry, right? So this was an expensive requirement, and these developing countries, they that had comparative advantage of shrimping and exporting shrimps to other countries, they started losing their comparative advantage, because if they had to buy these nets, the cost of shrimping would go high and they would reduce their comparative advantage. Um, and then again, many countries in Asia had a huge problem with this prohibition, with this ban in US, because they felt that the time difference in implementation was very less. So they were only given 4 months, 4 months to adopt to this new way of fishing. And when you're looking at developing countries where fishing industries usually are quite unorganized, you cannot change the way the shrimping is done or the shrimps are harvested over 4 months. It is just not enough. And they also had issues because US had previously reached out to some Central American and Caribbean countries, and they had sold these nets to these countries, and these countries had 5 to 6 years to adapt to this technology. But other countries in South Asia, developing countries, did not have this time to adapt to this new technology of shrimping. And US did not accept any alternative. US said it's either TED or nothing. If you're not using TED, you cannot export your shrimp to our market. So, as I said, various countries had issues and they came up with millions of arguments against US in this case. One of the complainants was India, and India said that you should not teach us about the conservation of sea turtles, because 5 out of 7 species of sea turtles are found in Indian coastal waters. So we understand how to preserve them and conserve them. If we did not understand how to conserve them, we would not have 5 out of 7 species in the Indian coastal waters. India also argued that turtle is an incarnation of one of our gods, Lord Vishnu, and therefore protecting the life of turtles is not just an animal concern for us, but it is also a religious concern for us. And therefore, we understand how it's to be done. And we have a legislation, we have laws, and we have practices for the protection of sea turtles. Malaysia, that had its own set of arguments. They said that forget about using TEDs, for example. We are using hand retrieval nets, which are even safer than TEDs, because we don't tie the nets at the back of the fishing vessel. We shrimp, we go out to the sea and we shrimp using a net with hands. And in that way, you have way less probability of accidentally killing sea turtles. So our method is much safer than use of TED for the sea turtles and for their lives. And we have laws in place. We have Department of Fisheries monitoring the implementation of the law. And we have one island and one coastal area reserved for mating and nesting of sea turtles, Sabah and Sarawak. So we are taking a lot of measures, and TED is not the only way, the godly way to save sea turtles. Arguments from Pakistan. Pakistan said that very similar to Indian argument. They did not invoke the religious line, but they said that it's sinful in our culture to kill sea turtles, and therefore we completely protect them. So India invoked a religious argument. Pakistan invoked a cultural argument, right? And they also argued that since 1950. US came up with this law in 1990s, right? But in Pakistan, since 1950, they have the Import and Export Control Act to protect endangered species. They also have a Sindh Wildlife Department, an institution to protect sea turtles and endangered species. So US should not teach how to conserve sea turtles to this country. Thailand had their own arguments, its own arguments. So Thailand said that we have a legislation, we have Department of Fisheries, who is only taking care of not killing sea turtles. And moreover, from 1967 to 1996, we have no observed case of killing a sea turtle in connection with shrimping. So it doesn't happen in our waters, and therefore it is not a concern for us. So pretty much the arguments against or the challenges against US were boiled down to the point that is TED the only option? And South Asian countries came up with the response saying, no, TED is not the only option. And one of the options could be TSD, Turtle Saving Device. So South Asian countries got together and they came up with Turtle Saving Device, TSD, where it was pretty similar. It was very, very similar. What they did was they took this traditional net and they installed a grid of bar. But the only difference between TED and TSD was that in TSD, this grid of bars had bars placed at a wider distance. So the distance between each metallic bar in this grid was higher. So what happened in that case? Because these developing countries argued that when you use a net with a grid of bars, where bars are placed at a very narrow distance, it does not allow the fishermen to harvest the variety or species of fish that are slightly bigger in size, because they also get caught in this grid of bars, and therefore to also harvest bigger species of fish, they wanted to have and they wanted to use TSD, because TSD has a grid and it would not allow a sea turtle to cross through. It also has an escape opening at the bottom, as you can see, so the turtle will get stuck at the grid and escape from the bottom. However, because the bars are placed at a at a bigger distance, this grid would allow the bigger species of fish to cross through and get caught at the end of the cod net. And basically the country said, so we have TSD, why don't we use TSD? TSD also allows us to save the sea turtles. And there were countries that said that even TED is not suitable for larger sea turtles, because the fish eye that TED has is quite small. So it only allows smaller and medium species of sea turtles to escape. But if you have huge loggerhead sea turtles, they will not be able to escape the net, the fish eye, and therefore it doesn't really work for these larger species. And they also argued that we're developing countries, and many times there's a lot of debris in the sea waters now, and this debris gets caught in the grid. And because it gets caught in the grid, when we get to our destination, we realize that we have not caught any fish, because the whole grid was pretty much blocked with plastic and polythenes and another kind of debris from seawater. So it really doesn't work, because it's inefficient. It's economically inefficient, because it also increases the transaction cost of shrimping. So after providing these objective arguments, the complainants also said that, well, we think that US is trying to protect their domestic shrimp industry, and their main objective is not really about conservation of sea turtles, but about the protection of their domestic shrimp industry. Because in Indian and Thai and Malaysian shrimps are tropical shrimps, and the shrimps found in American waters are temperate shrimps. So these South Asian countries argued that the texture and the taste of tropical shrimp is better than temperate, and therefore they have a higher demand in the US market. So they are trying to increase, by banning the import of tropical shrimps, they're trying to increase the demand of temperate shrimp in their market. And also US is trying to protect their domestic industry, because these Asian countries have a comparative advantage of shrimping at a much lower cost. So even though they shrimp and they export all the shrimp to the US markets, which definitely requires a lot of transportation and export cost, it is still cheaper. The tropical shrimp that you find in the American market is still cheaper than the temperate shrimp that is shrimped in the country and in the surrounding neighboring countries. So they blamed US that you're doing this as a protectionist measure. You're not doing this because you're concerned about saving the sea turtles. So what happens here? India, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Thailand, they get together and they file a case against US at the WTO. And they argue that this is a violation of MFN that we have studied in the last class, Article 1.1. This measure is a violation of Article 1.1. and it cannot be justified under Article 20G. The US argues that okay, it accepts that it's a violation of non-discrimination principles. It doesn't give any argument for that, but it says that US is allowed to have this measure under Article 20G, right? It is allowed to have this measure under Article 20G because the measure seeks to protect sea turtles, which are an endangered exhaustible natural resource. So the case goes to the panel. The panel rules that yes, US measure is inconsistent with Article 1.1. So it violates Article 1.1 without any doubt. So now the question for the panel was to decide whether US is allowed to justify its measure and whether US can invoke Article 20G. So the panel decided that yes, the US can invoke Article 20G and satisfy the three requirements of the three-tier test of Article 20G. But remember, once you have satisfied the requirements of the subparagraph of Article 20G, to fully invoke the measure, you have to satisfy the requirements of the chapeau, the introductory paragraph of Article 20. And that's where the US was caught. It was winning the case, but it could not satisfy the elements of the chapeau that we are going to see now. So just to finish off with Article 20G, what is the first element? First requirement of 20G, conservation of exhaustible natural resource. The panel said, yes, no problem. US is doing this for the conservation of natural exhaustible resource. The second requirement relating to, it's not necessary. Okay, so the element of necessity is not there. And the panel said, yes, the measure relates to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources. We don't know if it would be necessary, but the measure relates to. And Article 20G only requires a relation and not necessity between the end and the means, right? And the third element is in conjunction with restrictions on domestic production. So is the US imposition of this measure even-handed? The panel said yes, because the US has imposed these restrictions on domestic shrimping as well. So if anyone is caught shrimping in the US without TEDs, there are criminal and civil sanctions to follow. So the panel clearly said that the imposition of restriction is on domestic as well as foreign shrimping, and therefore US satisfies the test of even-handedness. So US, without any problem, satisfied provisionally justified all three requirements under Article 20G, and it was completely winning the case until here. But could it satisfy the requirements of the chapeau that you must satisfy after you've satisfied the requirements of all the subparagraphs of Article 2020? So once, whether you're invoking Article 20A or 20B or 20G, you first have to satisfy the requirements of the subparagraph of Article 20A or B or G. And once you've done that, you have only provisionally justified your measure under that exception. To fully justify your measure, you have to go on and then satisfy the requirements of the chapeau. So it is absolutely fundamental for us to understand what chapeau means and what chapeau entails, so we can justify a measure under Article 20. So the chapeau reads as follows. Subject to the requirement that such measures are not applied in a manner which would constitute a means of arbitrary or unjustified discrimination between countries where the same conditions prevail, or a disguised restriction on international trade, countries are allowed to protect public morals, animal health, plant health, conservation of exhaustible natural resources. So the subparagraphs focus on the measure, and this chapeau, as you can see, focuses on the application of the measure. So all it is saying is that the measure, okay, we agree that you have satisfied the requirements of one of the subparagraphs of Article 20, but the measure should not be applied in an arbitrary or unjustifiable manner between the countries where the same conditions prevail. Or, this is an or requirement. So this is an optional requirement, or it should not constitute a disguised restriction on international trade. So if there is any evidence to prove that US was only trying to or the US has had evil intentions of protecting their domestic industries and restricting trade, but they were not really concerned with the conservation of sea turtles, then the second requirement, the second optional requirement of the chapeau would have been met. However, in this case, US could not satisfy the first requirement because the court ruled that the measure is applied in an arbitrary and unjustifiable manner. So the question is, what is arbitrary and what is unjustified application of the measure? Right? So as discussed, chapeau has two elements. And chapeau, or the introductory paragraph, the first paragraph of Article 20, basically aims to ensure that members cannot misuse the exceptions provided under Article 20. It adds another filter, it adds another layer of scrutiny whenever a country is trying to invoke an exception under Article 20. It adds a layer of making the invocation of that exception more difficult because the country has to first satisfy the requirements of the exception and then it has to satisfy the requirements of the chapeau. So basically, the chapeau aims to find the line of equilibrium between invoking the exception or protecting the non-discrimination principles, right? And it has two elements, but these two elements are or, they have an or between them, right? So if the complainants can prove that this measure constitutes arbitrary or it is applied in an arbitrary or unjustifiable manner between countries where the same conditions prevail, then the chapeau would not allow the respondents to invoke the exception of Article 20. Or if the complainants can prove that the measure is not a disguise or the measure is a disguised restriction on international trade, then the respondent will not be allowed to invoke Article 20. However, the burden of proving the chapeau rests on the party which is responding to the action, which is invoking Article 20. They have to prove that the measure or the application of the measure does not constitute arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination between similar countries, or it does not constitute a disguised restriction on international trade. So what happens in the US shrimp case? In the US shrimp case, basically, the panel and the appellate body said that the whole measure was discrimination, but this kind of discrimination was allowed. But the problem was that the discrimination was arbitrary and unjustified. And this is how they defined arbitrary. They said a measure is applied in an arbitrary manner when a measure is applied without regard to different conditions prevailing in importing and exporting countries. And if you remember, the parties in the US shrimp case had very different conditions, right? So the respondent in this case is a developed country with huge wealth of resources, but the complainants in this case were developing poor emerging economies in South Asia with less wealth of resources. So there were different conditions, and therefore the court said that in US shrimp, US applied this measure without any regard to different conditions prevailing in different countries. It did not understand that maybe US or the fisheries industry in the US could afford using TED, but the poor countries in South Asia, developing countries in South Asia, cannot afford this fishing technology. And the measure was applied in a very rigid and inflexible way. And that's also why they called it arbitrary in nature. They also said that the measure was unjustified because the US failed to engage other countries in cross the border or across the board negotiations for the protection of sea turtles before imposing this ban, this blind blanket ban over the import of any kind of shrimp, which is shrimp without using threads. And they also said that if you really want to conserve sea turtles, which are a highly migratory species. I mean, sea turtles don't remain in US waters for all their lives, right? They cross waters and they go from one ocean to the other, and they migrate in different areas and different regions. So if you want to conserve this highly migratory species, then you need to engage other countries, and you need to engage in negotiations between the countries and agree as a body of countries as to how you would act together to conserve this exhaustible natural resource, because you cannot just impose restrictions in your own country and protect the sea turtles in the waters of Americas. So you must go beyond and try to negotiate a measure which other countries can afford and agree to. So US did not do so. US did not engage in any kind of negotiation. It only tried to negotiate, but it was a one-way negotiation where I think Central America was quite in a Stockholm syndrome sort of situation, right? Because they were clearly the underdogs here, and they accepted what the US imposed on them. But they did not engage in these negotiations with other countries they were exporting most of their shrimp from. And therefore, the panel said that this measure is applied in an unjustified way. So, what is arbitrary? Arbitrary is when you're applying a measure without any regard to different conditions in different countries, and the measure is very rigid without any sort of flexibility, and a measure is applied in an unjustified way when you have not made any effort to engage in negotiations with other countries that are being harmed due to the measure. So I just copied and pasted a couple of paragraphs from the judgment of US Shrimp to better explain to you what arbitrary is, or how they clarified the expression of arbitrary application. So with respect to arbitrary procedure, this is what the court said. They said with respect to both types of certification, there is no formal opportunity for an applicant country to be heard or to respond to any arguments that may be made against it in the course of the certification process before a decision to grant or deny certification is made. So there is no opportunity for the applicants who apply for the certification. The certification allows them to export shrimp to US market. So there is no opportunity for these applicants to be heard or to respond to the arguments. And you will only have communication with the authorities once a decision has been made and they have accepted your appeal or your application for a certification. And there's no formal process, no reasoned decision is rendered on applications. So countries whose applications are denied, they also do not receive a notice of such a dismissal or a denial. They just see that their name is omitted from the list of approved applications, and they do not get any reasons as to why their application was denied or dismissed. So, and there is no procedure for filing a review or application of the decision. So this is a very rigid, inflexible, blind measure where you would just file for a certificate, and if you don't get it, you really can't do anything about it. And the process is not transparent at all. And they went on to say that the measure is very rigid, and WTO members it is forcing WTO members to adopt a regulatory program that may not merely be similar, but it has to be essentially the same. So it is pretty much US is forcing all other countries to employ TED as their fishing technology. And even though other countries can come up with alternatives which might have a similar effect, US says that no, it's either TED or nothing. So the whole measure is quite rigid and it's quite unbending as a standard, and specific policies and measures that an exporting country may have to adopt, they're not taken into account, even though those practices or policies might be more efficient than TED. So it was a blind measure, and therefore it was seen as an arbitrary application of the measure. Why was it seen as an unjustified application of the measure? Well, the court said this. Another aspect of application of this law that US has come up with that bears heavily in the appraisal of unjustified or justifiable discrimination is the failure of the US to engage the complainants in this case. This was at the stage of appeal, as well as other WTO members exporting shrimp to the US in serious negotiations with the objective of concluding a bilateral or a multilateral agreement for the protection and conservation of sea turtles before enforcing a total prohibition or a total ban against the shrimp exports of those other countries. So the US clearly did not make any effort to engage seriously in negotiations, um, and um, and they banned the import of shrimp without any negotiations or without any efforts. And the resulting situation is very difficult because the US claims that it is trying to conserve a highly migratory species, but to conserve that highly migratory species that transverses many, many, many waters, it is important to have some kind of international standard, right? So the decision was that, okay, their measure is preliminarily justified under Article 20G because they've satisfied the requirements of Article 20G, but the requirements of SHAPO are not satisfied because the measure is applied in an arbitrary and unjustifiable manner. And that was the US shrimp case. And this is how you satisfy the requirements of the chapeau. So once you have satisfied, once again, just as a final reminder, please remember that in the next session where we will see each other, we will be doing a mock litigation. I will be giving you a problem question where you will look at the facts, hypothetical facts, and you will have to invoke Article 20 A, Article 20B, Article 20G, and justify your country's measure. If you are the respondent or if you are the complainant, you have to argue that the measure is not justified. But to do so and to invoke Article 20A, B, or G, you first have to satisfy the requirements of that specific subparagraph. And after you've done that, you have to go to the chapeau and argue as a respondent that the chapeau is satisfied, or as a complainant that the chapeau is not satisfied. And this is how you argue. So these paragraphs from the judgment of US Shrimp give you a clear idea of how a court would approach about deciding whether a measure is applied in an arbitrary or unjustifiable manner. Now, the other important exceptions in GATT 1994 are these. For example, the security exception, which is found in Article 21 of GATT 94. So it basically allows countries to violate their obligations if their national security interests are at stake. For example, recently there has been several cases where respondents have invoked Article 21, and up until 2019, so up until last year, this exception was never invoked because all countries thought that this exception is a Pandora box. Because of the way this exception is drafted, it is drafted in a very loose and ambiguous fashion. So countries felt that this is a Pandora box. Once we open it, all countries would try to justify all their violations under Article 21. But last year in 2019, it was invoked by Russia when Ukraine filed a case against Russia for certain violations of GATT 1994. And Russia said that, well, we have a national security interest at stake because we have had some political conflicts with Ukraine for the annexation of Crimea and all the situations and circumstances leading up to the situation in 2019. So there was a political conflict between them, and therefore they had to impose some trade restrictions against Ukraine because they wanted to protect their national security interest. Russia won the case. It was allowed to do so. But understanding security exception is not within the ambit of our course, but I still wanted to touch upon it nonetheless. You have other exceptions. So you might question me, okay, Amrita, you're telling us about the principles of non-discrimination, but how are countries allowed to negotiate free trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, regional trade agreements? Isn't that a violation of Article 1, most favored nation? Well, yes, but countries are still allowed to do it under Article 24, which is the regional integration exception. And there are some other exceptions, but they're not absolutely essential. One other exception, which has not been very relevant and important so far, but probably might come to light, especially during and post pandemic, is the economic emergency exception that you can see, number second in the list. So countries are allowed to violate their obligations if they have some kind of economic emergency. And I'm guessing that this pandemic, COVID-19 situation would lead to economic meltdown in many countries. It is already resulting in economic meltdown and recession in many countries. So countries probably would be allowed to invoke this exception to violate the principles of WTO law and free trade agreements. So these are some other exceptions, but they are not covered in the course, and therefore you don't have to look at these provisions. However, now is the time when I would strongly advise you, before you start reading, I have uploaded 2 readings that you have to do after attending this lecture, and then you will get to the quiz. But before you get to the readings and the quiz, I would strongly urge that you go to GAT 94 text and read Article 20 completely. So read Article 20, read the introductory paragraph, the chapeau, and then the subparagraphs. And once you've done that, then you go on to your reading, read the articles, and then attempt the quiz. All right, then I will see you for mock litigation soon. And I really hope you enjoyed this session. If you have any confusion, any doubts, any questions, then we can certainly discuss them when we see each other on in a live session. Right. All right, then. Thank you.